Hey, YouTube, how is it going? I hope all is well. So today we're just going to talk about a subject that's kind of blowing up right now on the gear page. So as you may have heard, the Wampler Pedalhead has come out, and they got some pretty interesting claims, and there's some stuff going on about it. But some of the conversation that's coming up is kind of the same conversation that's been going on for years now. Like, why is it that a digital amplifier, no, it's not even digital. We're going to call it digital, even though it's not really what it is, but a Class D amp doesn't seem to do the same thing or have the same kind of output and feel as a tube amp. We're going to pretend that this is a tube amp today, all right? So if these guys over here, Digital Realm, trying to replace all this stuff here. So you got all these knobs, transistors, capacitors, and all this technology here to literally replace something like this where it's stupid simple. It takes a lot of work to do that kind of stuff. But we need to understand a couple, practical things about these things, right? The way that they work. What makes them inherently different? Well, the big thing that makes these two things completely different is how they operate. And that one thing is the power supply. So in a Class D amp or many Class A amps or whatnot, they operate in a method called fixed voltage. Okay, so that means that the power supply produces a fixed voltage that the remainder of the amp will work off of for its power, to create power with. Whereas a tube amp works off of what's called fixed current. Now, it's not fixed current in the way that you think it is, but you've still got a power supply that produces a voltage that goes to the power tubes. The power tubes change the voltage. They swing a voltage across the primaries of the output transformer, which is a transmission, more or less. And when we think of transmission, we think of changing gears. Well, that's what these secondary taps are. So you got your 4, 8, and 16 ohm tap, right? That is the transmission that I speak of when I refer to a tube amp and the output transformer. So on this end here, we've got the angry pixies swinging back and forth, to and fro, inducing a change on the output transformer that goes from a voltage to a current. So over here, we've got a low voltage, high current. So over here, we have a lower voltage with a higher current because you're taking a high voltage and dumbing it down to some other fixed voltage, right? That's what all those capacitors and everything else do. It's taking that 120 volts and it's probably setting the rail at 50 volts or something like that. So the rail is set for 50 volts, and then that 50 volts is shared to whatever load it is. It doesn't care if it's actually 8 or 16 ohms. It's a fixed voltage that it works with. And when you convert that voltage into the load that you're powering, that's why these Class D and other Class AB amps like that, the solid state amps, that's why they work the way they do. At 4 ohms, you have 100 watts. At 8 ohms, you have 50 watts. And at 16 ohms, you generally have 25, right? It usually goes by half. And it has to do with that fixed voltage getting converted into each of those different loads. Whereas this guy here has a transmission to take that voltage that you have over here, it converts over here, but it reflects across each of those different taps so that the same relative wattage is available, or the same relative voltage, regardless of the tap that you're using. So at 16 ohms, you still get the same amount of voltage as you would as the 4 ohm to create the same wattage. Okay, so in a tube amp, it's 50 watts at 4 ohms, it's 50 watts at 8 ohms, and it's 50 watts at 16 ohms. Fixed current device, fixed voltage device. That's one of the major differences between the two. That is one factor, not the whole thing though. The second factor is how they distort. Okay, so when they're in their linear range, when this is working without distortion and when that is working without distortion, watt for watt, they are the same. Okay, a watt is a watt. It doesn't matter how you measure it, as long as you measure it properly. But whether a tube amp is doing it or whether a Class D digital amp or whatever amp is doing it, it's always going to be the same. And let's show what that means, okay? We're going to bust out the Mr. Calculator here. If you wouldn't mind, thank you. Let me clear that out. It's a real show already. All right, so we're going to imagine that we got 15 volts on this output here. 15 volts here too, whatever it is, right? So you take that 15 volts and you square it. So 15 times itself, 15 squared, right? Equals some large number. And then we divide it by the load that we're feeding out of. We're going to say it's a 16 ohm load, okay? So if we take that 15, square it up, and then divide that into our 16 ohm load, we get 14 watts essentially, okay? So we have 14 watts. Over here, if you measure 15 volts, it's the same 14 watts. It doesn't matter. They're both the same, okay? But what's going to happen is we're going to get to a point where this guy starts to maybe start squeezing up a little bit, right? It's starting to distort, but it hasn't reached its limit yet. This one here, it might not be doing that yet. It might still be clean. It might still have plenty of power left to go. But at some point, these two are going to start to converge from each other in terms of how they operate. And what I mean by that is how they start to distort and break up and whatever. They start to go non-linear, okay? We, as humans, tend to like distortion, believe it or not. Up to about 10% harmonic distortion, THD, total harmonic distortion. We seem to be okay with it. Once we get beyond that, we start to realize that it is distortion, like actually distortion that we don't want to hear. Well, these guys here tend to operate at lower THD levels. Tend to. Not always, but tend to. Whereas these guys generally start pretty high, and they don't generally ever get much lower, right? It only goes worse and worse and worse. That is another factor. So when you run this thing balls out, right? You've got all that distortion in the power section. You've got all the kind of distortion that goes on, and you love it. It sounds glorious, and it's because of the way that it breaks up. This one here has a hard ceiling. When it runs out of zeros and ones, or the power rail, or the rail, the voltage rail in it hits its zero, right? It's out of voltage to give. The transistors shut off, it distorts, and it sounds yucky. Doesn't work. It doesn't sound good. Whereas this one here, it just tries to do what it can do with what it has to do it with. It doesn't shut off hard, right? It doesn't hit the ceiling and stop. It kind of just squishes a little bit. So you can get a higher level of appearance in power, or perceived power, if you will, over this. Even though realistically speaking, they're pretty much watt for watt the same. But this one doesn't sound very good when it distorts. This one does. So that's another large factor in how we kind of perceive the two as having a different feel and a different sound, and which one does what better. And then the last thing, and I mentioned it the other night in the live that I was doing, to sum that up, we talked about all kinds of subjects, but one of the subjects we touched on was damping factor. So let's talk a little bit about that. So over here, you can see on our screen, I'm going to change this number real quick because I don't want to give anything away. Hold on. I'm going to put that. There you go. Whatever. It doesn't matter. You already seen it. But in either case, go to damping factor. Just punch in damping factor calculator in your Google search bar, and this will be one of the ones that'll probably come up at bcae1.com. And you want to go to dampfact.htm. So we're going to imagine our amplifier power output is 100 watts. Doesn't really matter. And then we're going to say our speaker cable length is 15 feet. We're going to go into a 16 ohm load. We don't care. But we're going to say our amp has a, we're going to work with a tube amp in this case right now. So we're going to say it has a DF of 50. And then our speaker wire gauge, we're going to say is 16. What do you think we're going to end up with a damping factor? We'll come back to what this actually does and what it means for us in a bit. But for right now, we're going to say that our tube amp has a DF of 50. What do you think we're going to end up with in this scenario right here? Well, you'd be surprised to know that you lose a little bit over half. All right. So this is our effective damping factor with all that detail there. So if we started with, 100 watts, we actually get 95 watts to the speaker. So we lose almost 5 whole watts in this situation just by using a 50 watt or 50 foot cable that has that 16 gauge with a DF of 50. Well, let's swap this around a little bit. Let's go to a 1 foot cable, which is pretty short for us in terms of speaker cable. We're usually maybe 2 or 3 feet, but let's just say it's 1 foot. And we're also going to be cool, and we're going to get at least a 12 gauge wire. Now, what do you think our DF is going to be? I'll bet you'll be surprised. We only lost about 0.5% or half a DF or whatever you want to call it. 0.5 is what we lost. So we started with 99 watt or 100 watts, and now we got 99.95 watts that are actually hitting it. And our effective DF only dropped, a meager, minuscule amount. So imagine that, going from a 50 foot cable at 16 gauge to a 1 foot cable at 12 gauge, and we got all of our DF back. So now let's go the other way. So now we're going to work with a Class D amp that probably has a DF closer to 500. Not all of them do, but most of them are pretty close to that. 16. What do you think we're going to have as an effective DF given this scenario here? Same 100 watts, 50 foot cable, 16 ohm load, DF of 500 into a 16 gauge wire. What do you think we're going to have? You're about to be extremely surprised right now. We essentially lose all of our damping factor. We went from 500 down to 37. And we lost, again, about the same amount of wattage. So we still lost almost 5 watts of power. So that didn't change much. That's just due to the inherent nature of the wire itself. But, right? So those are the little things. Okay? So now, let's do the same thing. We're going to go with a 1 foot wire. And we're going to go to 12 gauge because we're cool. And you probably already saw that number before, but we only lost like just under 50. We lost maybe 45 DF. And again, we still have 99.9 watts out of our 100 going there. So you can kind of see the importance now of keeping a short cable with as high a gauge as you practically can. Now, what the heck does that even mean for us? Why do we even care about the damping factor? Realistically speaking, a good DF factor or damping factor is right around 125. So right around, or is it 25? I can't remember what it is. It's been a while since I've had to do the math on it. There's some number that is ideal to stick to. Now, these guys here, Class D and other solid state amps, tend to have a very high damping factor, usually better than 300, some as high as 600 or more, whereas these guys tend to have a lower damping factor. The damping factor is the ability of the amplifier to control or command the motion of the speaker, okay? So the more command the power amp has over the speaker, the more correct or linear the speaker will move to that input command, or whatever command you want to call it. Whereas with a lower DF amp, such as like a tube amp, it tells it to move forward, but the mass of the speaker says, nah, I don't want you to move me right now. But it starts to move eventually. And then the amp says, no, I need you to come back, right? Well, the mass of that speaker is like, yeah, I don't think you're going to move me back either. So then it goes out, the mechanical forces of the, the cone and all that stuff finally spring it back into the other way. But then it works both ways, right? So the amp itself lacks the command to be able to tell that mass where to move. Well, that has a huge impact on the sound quality, or sound and feel, if you will, of the amp in general. Now, these, Class D and other amps have, like I mentioned, have a pretty high damping factor in them, which means that they are more able to command the motion of that speaker. Get what I mean? So that is another one of the major differences. Now, another thing that is not so well understood about what goes on with damping factor and that, lack of control over the speaker motion is that it does have an impact on these guys here, okay? Especially on tube amps. So when the speaker is is moving without command, that means it is inducing a charge. A speaker that is forced into motion without command from the amplifier is then inducing its own charge. It turns into a motor. And when you turn the motor, it creates a voltage. And that voltage is pushed into the secondaries of this transformer now, which then kicks back through the transformer and hits the plates of the tubes themselves and has, interacts directly with the tubes, okay? So it can build up a charge and wreak havoc on the tubes in and of themselves. So that is another huge thing that comes into play with the different types of topologies of these amps here. So those are the three major reasons that these things don't react the same, even though watt for watt they are the same. So now we are getting into the world where these guys are starting to emulate all of that stuff, because we always seem to just go towards tube amps. Years ago, IRs used to be the weak link. They weren't really good. They were still kind of figuring it out. And, you heard an emulation of a speaker. It sounded like doo-doo. Well, now they got it so good that, the emulation of the speaker and the microphone and the space that they are in all together, it's almost indiscernible what the real one is versus that one is, all things being equal, right? So they finally gotten to the point where the IR for the speaker side of things is no longer the weak link. They're honing in very closely on the modeling side for the preamp end of things in a guitar amp. They're getting really, really, really close. I still don't think they have some of the feel and some of the other elements all the way there, but they're getting really close. The last frontier, and I think that's the one that Wampler is kind of trying to play with a little bit here, is that what I believe is going on, and why I brought up the damping factor is kind of one of those things. That interaction with the speaker cabinet and the how the amp in and of itself works with that speaker. So they're basically, what I think is happening, it's not really AI. It's not really AI that they have. What it is they have, it's not even really machine learning. It's a fixed whatever, right? So the box has X amount of parameters that it can work with. It has, a feature that it can sense what the cabinet is doing, and it takes a measurement from it, and then it compares that measurement to its target, its goal over here, and whatever parameters it has to try to mimic this to react the way that it wants it to, it does, right? Whether it's through negative feedback, altering the negative feedback loop, or playing with the damping factor of the amp a little bit, whether it's an EQ, whether it's adding in some element of an IR into the mix, whatever it takes to try to get this guy here to act and do whatever this target is there. So it does the inverse of all that fun stuff, and it yada, 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 XYZ. That's what I think is going on. Okay? I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's the direction that they're starting to go. Now, they are talking about it on the gear page quite a bit right now. And, everybody, like I mentioned, everybody's kind of still going on about how, it seems that digital amps or Class D amps and whatnot don't seem to have the same perceived power as these guys do. We kind of already beat that one up a little bit. I think the other frontier that they're starting to figure out is that they're running these things with more power. They're leaving headroom on the table, right? So watt for watt, we've already talked about it. If you have 15 volts here and 15 volts here, they're the same watts. But the way that this one breaks up is different than the way this one breaks up. So the only way around that is to make it so that this amplifier never breaks up. So they give it more power so that it has plenty of clean headroom, and then they emulate the power to break up into it. And now they're starting to see that they can play with things. I think one of the things that they're starting to play with is damping factor, adjusting the damping factor of the amplifier, whether it be by altering the negative feedback loop or however it is that they do it. They're trying to figure out a way to make this become that through this without the power amp being in a nonlinear state, which means that they can then do some sort of emulation, modeling, whatever you want to call it, to get the power section to do what they need it to do. So that's what I think we're up to these days. But do know this, that if you get, I mean, I guess it'd be kind of hard to justify, but I think we kind of showed it the other night a little bit. Like, we literally took a blues driver, I gotta hold it up here. I gotta get used to this camera being there. So we got our blues driver here, and we ran it into this guy's power amp here, which we weren't running, you know, it was still pretty low, but we ran it from this guy's power into the return there, out of this, into the 2 notes Torpedo Captor X that I had there, and then back through another power amp that I have. And it sounded damn good. Now, we were using the Torpedo Captor X to kind of create the speaker emulation, right? Because I kind of feel like they're doing some sort of emulation in this. It's baked into the preamp section. So now what I'm saying is that, you know, Wampler is kind of doing a similar thing, except for instead of doing it at the preamp side, now they're doing it at the output side. So it emulates the output section of the amp. It's kind of the same, but different, right? So whether I'm wrong or not, I don't know, but watt for watt, they're the same. Now they're just trying to hone in and bridge the gap between the perception that we have of a digital amp or Class D amp. I keep saying digital, it's not digital, versus that of an analog tube amp. Okay, so let me clarify what I mean by these aren't digital. It is not, it goes through an AD in many cases. So your input signal comes in and it goes through an A to D to D to A converter, right? Well, at some point it's converted into a pulse width modulated signal, right? So your input signal goes in and it's converted into a pulse width modulated signal. But the way that it's demodulated on the output side of your Class D amp, it is essentially analog. It's exactly the same as what went in on the analog aspect of your input. It's just a much larger version on the output. So don't be afraid to sit there and think that there's hash and some weird stuff, some artifacting, you know, the Nyquist theorem and all that fun stuff, or whatever the heck it is. That doesn't really exist in Class, you know, D amps anymore. They kind of worked that thing out. Another thing that's a big help with these guys now is how their power supply works. There are varying levels of switch mode power supplies, but they're getting better with them now. So, you know, your cheapest, switch mode power supply doesn't have power factor correction, doesn't have all these other little toys and cool doodads in it. Whereas some higher level ones I hope that we were probably using in some of these, do have things like power factor correction and other, you know, line filtering elements that make them more robust and more able to stabilize their voltages for the power rail. One would hope. But in either case, that differing level of the quality of those switch mode power supplies do have an effect on the linearity and, you know, overall impact that these do have. So the better designed the power supply is on these, generally the better the amp in and of itself will be. To the degree that if you have it over-spec'd, so you have, you know, 200 watts worth of actual power, but you're dumbing it down to 100 watts or 50 watts or whatever it might be, you know that the amp itself is never going to be distorting, or at least it shouldn't ever be, which then leaves it down to the emulation and the other digital DSP side of things that you might be doing to make it do these really well. And as we know, the modeling is getting really close in that regard. So just my little thoughts on what could be going on, but that is the major difference between those things. Those three major things are the big difference. So with that, I hope we answered some questions. I hope we got an idea. I just want to clarify that I do not dislike you know, solid state in any way. So I know it sounds like I poo-poo on it quite a bit. As a guitarist, yes, I tend to lean towards, you know, analog tube state stuff. And that's because it just, to me, it sounds, and it has the sound, it has the feel, and it has all those things that guitarists love with something that's really, really simple. I mean, this has no moving parts in it, essentially. And this has very few number of parts in it, comparatively to this guy here. So even if you left this on one setting and I had, you know, another couple knobs in here, there's a hell of a lot more going on in this one than there is in this, even if I were to add a power section to this. So it takes a heck of a lot of technology to try to emulate or copy what's already inherently easy and just being done for these guys. So that's why I really kind of prefer, you know, tube type stuff. Just saying. Aside from that, I'm really enjoying this Glenfiddich today. So I want to thank you for hanging with me as long as you have. I hope this clears some things up. And I guess that does it for this one. Take care. We'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.